you know, to be honest, maybe even despite us, right? So I look at this time as a sacred setting apart of, what's considered kind of a regular day, right? And that God would show up in a powerful way to share with us highlights of the sacred, that we might become even more aware that in the midst of what we might call the regular or the everyday, that the sacred is always there, and that our awareness can be heightened to that, and that we can engage with the holy, even in the middle of a day on a Wednesday. So thank you all so much for coming, for being here. If you have the opportunity to show your video, that would be great. Again, when I was on a couple of weeks ago visiting, I wasn't able to use my video, so I totally understand if that's not possible. Would you join me in prayer, please? Eternal and loving God, thank you so much that even before we call upon your name, you are already amongst us. Thank you that you set apart this time that we might get to know you better, that we might get to know each other better, that we might get to know ourselves better, who we've been created and called to be in this world. May this be more than just a checklist. Oh, we did Wednesday noonday study and covered these particular pages. May this be a holy experience, that we might join with the sacred, knowing more and more that we are sacred, and how much love you have for us and the world, that the world might change because of it. We're so grateful that you're here. We're so grateful for each other. Let us begin. Amen. All right, y'all, we're about to go into Joshua. This particular study has been looking at Deuteronomy. There's a lot of different ways that we could summarize Deuteronomy. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of conversations that you've had that I haven't been a part of because I haven't been here every week. One of the ways that I'd like to talk about it is just to offer a couple of things about Deuteronomy in general as a summary before we go into Joshua. But I'd also like to offer you the opportunity that if there's something that stood out for you, if there's a sentence or two that you'd want to put in the chat to allow us to gather wisdom that has happened over this time in studying Deuteronomy, I want to invite you to be able to do that as well. So I'll offer a couple of generalized kind of summary statements about Deuteronomy before we move forward. But again, if you've got anything that has come up in the study for you about the work of Deuteronomy that will help us move to Joshua, something poignant that needs to be there, please feel free to do that so that we can have that as part of our ongoing conversation. So Deuteronomy as a book is doing a couple of things. There's a sense that to be faithful, one must be fully faithful. There's a very much either or kind of thing happening in Deuteronomy, and the actions of people or the inactions of people, and whether or not they are following the book of the law is going to determine whether or not good or bad things happen to people. So when you see the fruits of good things, whatever is determined to be a good thing, right? When you see the fruits of that, then people were using this particular kind of theology to say, if you see good things happening, it's because that person is a good person. And if that person is a good person, it means that they're obeying God. And if they're obeying God, they're obeying the book of the law. So there's a very cut and dry kind of theology that's happening. This theology shows up in today's world too. There are a lot of Christians, there are a lot of religious people, there are a lot of just good intentioned, good conscious folks who believe this particular theology, that when good things happen, it means the person themselves morally is good, and that means that they're following some sort of moral code. Now, in the reality of the world, we see this theology being countered. And a lot of folks start struggling with their faith, with their relationship with God, with their understanding about how the world works when, and I'm going to say kind of quote unquote here, when bad things happen to good people, right? As we move through the Bible, we're going to see different kinds of theologies show up to try to address that. Like, how in the world, if you're a good person, how in the world could all of this horror, be happening? Or if we're following the book of the law, if we're obeying God, how is it possible that these things could be happening? So that is going to happen as we move forward. But when we're talking about Deuteronomy and this particular theology, we're talking about a very stark this or that. You follow the book of the law, you obey God, you're faithful, you're a good person, good stuff's going to happen. Otherwise, you're going to have curses, you're going to have problems, evil is going to show up, your stuff is not going to go well for you and your family if you're not doing these things. But again, what happens is folks take this theology very strictly to then say, if bad things are happening to you, it's because you're messing up. You're doing something you're not supposed to do. And that's the theology that's coming into Joshua. So we have this transition between Moses as leader to Joshua as leader. A couple of weeks ago, when I was amongst you, right at the end of that session, it was brought up, about the troubling parts of Joshua, the Deuteronomy, and specifically what are known as conquest narratives, right? If you obey God, God will give you this land. And then all of the things that come from that. What does it mean to take land that already is inhabited by somebody else? What does it mean to say, this is our God, but not your God? And so this land is our land because we're being good, because remember the Deuteronomy theology, and there must be something going on with you. You must be evil, because otherwise, why would God have us take this land? Right? The good thing is to have the land. So if we're called to get the land, that means we're doing the right thing. And if you're called to lose the land, then that means you are the other. You are the other folk, right? You are the folks that are not obeying God, that are not faithful, that are not chosen. So I see something coming up in the chat. Does this retribution theology apply to individuals, the nation, or both? Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Brother Summers. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of both and that's going on. A lot of the biblical material is going to be pointing to the collective, much more than, let's say, today's society in the United States. If we kind of talk generally, we might talk about more individualistic kind of things. But if we're talking about the Bible generally, we'll talk about the collective. Now, this also, though, shows up for individuals, especially when individuals are looked at, right? So let's say you're famous. Let's say you're a warrior, a leader, a king, right? All those things that show up in the books where they're laying out kings, right? And it says this king was really good and this stuff happened, or this king was really bad. They're talking about, it's a both and, right? They're talking about that king, but they're symbolizing it for the land at the time, the folks at the time. So I think what that means for us is that when we're thinking about this theology, we have to think, one, how they're thinking about it, but then also how does that translate for us, right? Because I imagine if I asked y'all to put something in the chat, you could come up with scenarios that you know from your own life where either we or somebody else has kind of claimed somebody's doing the right thing or not the right thing based on whatever outcomes are happening for them. Right? We can think about conversations that happen in the parking lot, at the kitchen table, over Bible study, or way out from Bible study. So there are ways that we talk about this being a national kind of thing, but also individual. So I think if we keep both of those things in mind as we go forward, that will help. But also, Brother Summers, I think if we articulate what we're talking about very specifically, that will help us have the same conversation, at least during, that particular period of time. Yeah.
Can I just ask one question?
Sure.
I was just trying to figure if it applies to individuals and individuals stray from God, does that mean that the whole nation is punished? And when you look at Deuteronomy 28, that's some pretty harsh punishment if just a few individuals stray and the whole nation is punished. That was the thought behind my question.
Right. And I think what you're pointing to is, one of the struggles of what it means to talk about, like, do bad things happen, do good things happen, right? It's messier than that. I think one of the things that we can take from it that has been helpful for me, at least, is that good and evil, as much as we might want to do it, can't be reduced to one cause and one effect. So we might be able to think of examples where somebody, especially if they have a lot of institutional or officialized power, but even if they don't, one person can do something and there's a ripple effect that happens, or one person doesn't do something and there's a ripple effect that happens. So one of the ways that we might be able to think about or wrestle with this material is to call out our temptation to be able to limit, like, this bad thing's going to happen because this one person did this thing. Also to wrestle with what does it mean that our actions or inactions have consequences that many times go well beyond whatever that one-on-one interaction is. How do we address that? Not just when it's good, bad, but when it's good too, right? Sometimes we get stuck with, why bother? This problem is so big, or, I'm just one little person and this whole structure is just a big spider web of oppression or mess or whatever. I think this kind of challenge helps us to be hopeful in some senses, and then also weary in some senses. I think that's a great way to bring in the work of Joshua during this time. Is there anybody else who'd like to jump in before we kind of hit the road running with the book of Joshua?
I guess the one thing is, as you talked about the good and the bad, and we're seeing now in this country a rise in attacks on Chinese people, Oriental people, and all
Asian people, right?
Asian people.
There you go. Yeah.
And all kinds of minorities now being attacked. Of course, all these shootings, And so I think when you talk about the ripple effect, what one person can do that incites people leads and who we allow our leaders to be really makes a difference. And my boy, we have learned that big time.
There's a couple of things that you're bringing forward. So one is, I already kind of jumped in about language. There's another language move that we're going to want to avoid, is the word minorities, because first of all, if we're talking about BIPOC people, like Black, Indigenous, Pacific Islander, Asian, and Latinx folks, we're actually talking about a global majority.
Yeah,
we're not talking about a minority, right? So the word minority actually centers whiteness. So we're going to avoid that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, these things have been happening all the time, right? There's a heightened awareness, especially among those of us who are white, because of the extent to which social media and videos and all of this stuff is coming out, and the sharing of that material, right? Yeah. So when you and I talk about it, or other white folks talk about it, we can talk about how our awareness is being raised because of the proliferation of the videos that we're making ourselves accessible to, right? So in that, there's all sorts of different things, right? One of the ways we can talk about it is that our actions as white folks, like as we increase our awareness, that provides more and more opportunities for us to act, right?
Yes.
Because without that awareness, we're not acting.
No,
right.
we are not.
The other thing is, again, like the larger kind of point that I think you're bringing forward is to say that because of this proliferation of video and that folks are seeing and folks are being exposed and becoming more aware, then more folks, some folks are horrified by it and some folks are like jumping on board.
Yeah.
So how do we attend to that? How do we think about what it means to be faithful, right? Just faithful Christians, faithful humans. What does it mean knowing that this kind of evil and atrocities are going on, and then tapping into our faith to create action, right? To step up and do something. And how do we do that in honorable ways? So yeah, thank you, Sister McKay, for bringing that forward, that we can add that, to our ongoing conversation. Because here's the thing, we in the book of Joshua, we've got to wrestle with some problematic things. Otherwise, we're just telling, superficial stories from a sacred text. Even in the introduction of where the Holy Imagination book, where this is bringing in the introduction and the genre of Joshua, there's, the section we're doing is the intro. It's like, what is this genre? What is kind of the overarching book of Joshua doing? And for our time today, it actually cuts off right before it gets to what's called like Holy War or the ban, right? So I don't want to go too far into that because I know that that's going to happen in the next session. However, the book of Joshua is a conquest text. And so what had happened 2 weeks ago when I was here the last time, right at the end of the session, it was brought forward to say, what do we do with a text that says, go in and snatch that land from folks that already have it, right? What do we do with that? And the person that brought that forward had actually said, if that's what God's about, I don't want to be about that. And that's a very real, honest, raw response that you don't get when you just do the superficial, storyland of Joshua. So what I was hoping to do today is tap into those final moments of like 2 weeks ago when we started to introduce, what do we do with texts that are really problematic? How do we address them without just tossing the whole thing out there, right? Now, that is an option. Some folks choose to do that. But for today, we've been tasked with looking at this book. So I was thinking we could wrestle with it a little bit together. So there is a strategy that we can use. It's not the only strategy, but I'm going to introduce it so maybe we can play with it a little bit. One way to look at problematic texts is to look at the text the best that we can from like, what is going on then? What is going on then, historically, culturally, and otherwise, that we can try to understand what the first readers are bringing with them when they read it. So that's the first step. The second step is then to address that based on what we know now. So there could be, usually are, assumptions that we've determined throughout history and over time, and maybe just our own experiences, that those are not acceptable. Those assumptions that are being made in the original text are no longer acceptable. And so now that's how we have to wrestle with it. What do we do with a text where the assumptions for the first writers are oppressive, unjust, unfaithful, what have you, right? What do we do with that? The third step, if we get there, right? The third step would be based on the original thing, like what was trying to be going on then, and then what we feel is faithful and acceptable to hold on to or to critique, then what does that mean for us today, right? A lot of times, and I'm speaking very, very generally now, Bible studies run into problems when we jump right to the what does this mean for us today? Because we're putting all of our assumptions in there too, right? And we can go far, far away from the actual text and start doing our own thing over here. And that's fine too. Like you can get some moral, faithful stuff over there, but you're no longer tethered to the text, right? So today I'm thinking we tether ourselves to the text and then we go from there.
Are you saying we're going to become originalists like the Supreme Court?
Well, no, because that's what I'm saying is the second and third move, right?
I know.
If it was like an originalist thing or
okay, Justice Scalia, it's okay. We can deal with it.
Okay, I think some of it is going over my head.
I'm just saying Justice Scalia was this originalist and said that what was written was needed to be followed, despite what we know from 1793. And that's what has created all the problems with gun control, for example, in the Constitution. So I'm just kind of kidding you in a way.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, because my second and third move moves us away from that.
I know.
Right. So, okay.
But
all
I
right,
may
so
like to be originalist, I could go with it maybe. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. All right, let's stay focused because we only have, so and so many minutes left. Because there's so many ways that we can go with this, right? There's so many ways to go with it. This is just one way. And, again, there's no way to exhaust it. But if we talk about just generally what you know about the book of Joshua or what you've read in this book about the intro in Joshua, is there anything you can say in the text that helps us understand kind of where the book of Joshua is coming from? Like big themes in Joshua. I'm focusing on pages 66 through maybe halfway down of 69, just in case you read and maybe took notes there or something.
Hello, Dr. Leder. Well, we know that, Reverend, we know that Joshua is in the same line as Moses. He's sanctioned by God, and he should have all the respect and obedience that was afforded Moses.
Okay, great, excellent. So there's some sort of continuation that's going on here, which brings us back to, the summary of Deuteronomy, because that kind of theology is still there. It hasn't been countered yet. So thank you so much, Brother Botts. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, the other thing that I see is, and this is written in the text, God's fulfillment of Abraham's promise.
Okay, yeah. So not only is it some sort of continuation of what was just here, but this is an ongoing way of understanding what God is doing in the world and in and through people. So it's not just this thing happened over here, we're just going to keep it moving, this particular strategy or something. This is also speaking to how the people understand what God is doing in the world. Thank you. I see that Sister Marion is saying, what was the third step listed? That's the what does that mean for us today move. So the first is what's going on then, based on what we know now. The second move is based on what we know now. Are these things that are faithful for us or need to be critiqued? And then the third move is what does this mean for us today? So right now we're in the first move.
And the one thing I remember is that Moses didn't make it because he had, upset God. So he had been punished in a way.
Right. So the Deuteronomy theology is showing up in hey, if Moses had done the right things, Moses would have been able to make it through, right? Yeah. That theology is showing up. So the one thing we know, from the story is that Moses isn't there. The theological interpretation that's happening is that the reason Moses doesn't make it is because he got in the way of some of the things that God was trying to do, right? Then there's a continuation, which stems back to that, like, what is God doing overall, right? God's not, even if you take that theological interpretation and say, Moses didn't make it because he did some stuff to obstruct what God was trying to do, doesn't mean God then drops the ball and says, well, forget all of you, right? God then reaches back to the Abrahamic promise and says, all right, here's Joshua, right? So, and then based on what Brother Botts was saying, right, that Joshua is supposed to have all of the credibility, because it's like a giving over, it's a laying on of hands kind of thing, right? This is good. Yeah. So tell me about the this is a military text. Joshua is a military leader. There's the promise of, like, hey, be strong and courageous, but the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Every step you take, God is with you, right? This is land that God is going to give you. So what's going on with that in the text, in the kind of intro stages?
I read it as kind of as rationalizing what they've done or what they feel they need to do. So we'll give it this spiritual patina and it's all okay.
Right. And again, I'm not trying to like move to that third stage really fast, but we see that a lot, right? That this can be one of the things that we start to pay more and more attention to when we, the general we, justify what we're doing with God language. Maybe that's a moment where we have to pay special attention, right? What are the assumptions that are being brought in? What are the theologies that are being used? And then in our second move, is that something that's still faithful, right? So let's take that, what you just brought up, Sister Bennett, what you just brought up there, the God justification move. If we're talking about a conquest narrative, whereas we're using the Deuteronomy theology and the historian that's writing this material, who says that if you're following God, if you're being faithful, then good things are going to happen. They don't have land, right? They are folks who do not have land, and they are claiming that God is giving them land. And this land currently belongs to other people, is being inhabited by other people. How do we understand that based on what we know today? Like if we were just to use like how we think about morality, how we think about faith, how we think about the world, how we think about our lives, how would we talk about that?
Well, if I were living in Israel, I'd say 1948 was supposed to happen because.
Right. So you're talking about the start of the nation of Israel, right? Yeah. Right. It shows up there. That it clearly, right? This is a central narrative of the nation of Israel, like it becoming a country. So yeah, then and this is exactly why often people aren't able to talk about whether or not Israel is supposed to be there like that, because they're challenging back and forth about like, is God providing land for a people who have been slaughtered and don't have land? What do we do with the folks who are already there? And if we're using the Deuteronomy history and theology, then that's going to create an us and them, an us who is good and a them who is evil. Was it Sister Linda, Sister Aarons?
Yes. How you doing?
Hi, greetings.
It's not just Israel, it's Ethiopia, it's the
Mhm.
Ukraine, and it's the reason why people are enslaved yesterday, today, tomorrow. People just feel like they can take what they want and then they can justify it because they are the ones that are the good people.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're doing really horrible things. And they use God to justify what it is that they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. How might we talk about this with regards to the Metropolitan AME church building?
I think there are people in DC today that would love that property.
Yeah, tell me more. Say more.
They have encroached on the land and the things that are around it. I remember the fight that we had over the bike lanes, a couple of years ago. And people just feeling like, it doesn't matter that this is a church that's been here for, almost 200 years. And, we need a place, when we have funerals to park cars and, and on Sunday morning and things like that. And that encroachment continues in a lot of different ways in that area of DC. It has changed tremendously over the years that I've been there. And I haven't been there as many years as a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So what we did in that one move right there was we flipped, right? We flipped from maybe considering it from Joshua's point of view, like what happens that way, right? To Metropolitan, because Metropolitan, the Joshuas are coming at Metropolitan, right? So what we're doing is we're challenging the narrative, the biblical story, based on what we know. Sister Marion, please.
Well, in the letter from the district Baltimore conference or whatever that office is called in 1870, whatever, that authorized the construction of the building, it said it was a building to be built, it was a church to be built, and it didn't say, on land we owned or in a Negro neighborhood. It said in close proximity to the Congress and the White House. So that is such a political, militant, activist, wonderful statement for a group that wasn't 10 years out of enslavement. It always sends chills down my spine every time I think of it. And I'm sorry we no longer have programs at church because it used to be quoted on the back cover of the program. So, that's just such a wonderful statement. It's not a peaceful statement. It's in your face. So I don't know how spiritual that is. I mean, that's just real politics,
Right. But the spiritual, if we're looking at the Bible, right, we might say the Bible's spiritual, right? And the Bible's like full of political stuff, military stuff, all the stuff. All the stuff is showing up there, not in the sanitized versions, right? But if we're looking at the actual text, it's in there. So, okay. So here's the thing, Sister Marion, this is what I want to pull this out too. The statement that's happening you said from folks that are maybe not even yet 10 years out from enslavement, right? We're talking about folks who didn't have land and now are claiming this land, right? There's a difference. There's a difference that's happening between, or is there? Let me say that. Is there a difference between that and the Joshua folks coming in and taking the land? And if there is a difference, what is it?
The only difference is that we didn't push away the Native Americans who were there first. They had already been pushed out.
Okay. So is it a faithful thing to take over the land that has been stolen from someone else, but it was stolen by someone else?
Well, I don't know. We didn't push out the Native Americans, but they had been pushed out. It was their land.
Right. Yeah. And I'm not, look, it's like, all right, Michelle's causing problems now. Like, what is going on? I'm not saying, look, I'm just putting it out there. I'm saying these are realistic things to struggle with. One of the things that happens, especially in white evangelicalism, is that false equivalencies are made all over the place, right? This, if it happens over here and it happens over here, it's the same exact thing. First of all, that's hardly ever true. Because if you're talking about different groups of folks, if you're talking about different racial identities, if you're talking about different experiences, if you're talking about, if there are any differences at all, there's going to be some kind of way that we need to bring those differences to the top to at least be able to acknowledge them honestly, right? So Joshua represents a group of people who were enslaved, right? Like Exodus is talking about them coming out of enslavement, right? While they were in enslavement, they were in enslavement so long that they no longer knew people firsthand that knew freedom firsthand, right? It was so many generations that now all they have are the stories. All they have are the stories and the narratives that have been brought forward. They know that they were treated unfairly. They knew that they were the folks who were the direct targets of that oppression. And now they've had a series of like, what does it mean for us not to be enslaved, but not to have land? Then they get to the place where they understand this Deuteronomy theology that if we do good, good things will happen. And if we do evil, evil things will happen. Then they get to a place where they have come to understand that God is giving them land and that it is acceptable for them to take it forcefully from other people who are currently there. They attach their theology to that to say that since we are the faithful people, since we've been set apart by God, it's okay to take this because this is the reward that God is giving us. If we are successful in battle, this tells us that God is rewarding our faithfulness. And the reason that we're able to take it, if that's the way it plays out, is because the folks who are currently there are not of God. They are not set apart, and they are not faithful. So now we've talked about a couple of different ways that we can think about that currently, and then I brought up the Metropolitan building, which has a lot of nuances to it, right? And again, this isn't to cause trouble. This is not why I'm bringing this forward. I'm saying this is a very real thing, especially for those of us who are part of Metropolitan. This is a very real thing that we have to wrestle with and be able to talk about in an honest way, right? Sister Aarons, please.
The analogy of kind of looking at the land of Metropolitan and should we be on that land?
Mm-hmm.
No, but we shouldn't be here either. Because
say more.
We didn't choose to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And the Native Americans, the genocide upon them,
Mm-hmm.
there's no way that they could come back and reclaim that land. There's no way in this country they could reclaim that land. But we purchased the land to make sure that we could keep it as a sacred place.
Mm-hmm.
In Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
So that example, as we go through it a little bit more, I don't know how much of it, when you look at it from an African-American perspective, that we can leave, but where do we go to?
Mm-hmm.
Where else in the world could we go to, even in Africa, that the same things have not been done to us in Africa, in the Caribbean, and South America, throughout the diaspora?
Mm-hmm.
That's my thought.
Yeah. And at the very same time, right? African people who were stolen built this country at the same time. So even if we talk about even if we talk about, people who put in work are basically building land equity, right? I worked this land, therefore, right? If we go that route, then the reality is that Black descendants from Metropolitan, right, or ancestors rather, built many spots in the country and then are claiming this one spot. Not only this spot, but this spot. So if we talk about work creating equity and possession, then claim to land, again, I'm saying these are all the things that are playing out. It's just often we don't talk about it, right? There are ways that we can talk about the land of Metropolitan, how it's different for Black members of Metropolitan to hold on to that land and that building in the face of gentrification and in the face of threats of eminent domain and all of those different things, right? Those conversations can happen right alongside whose land is this or was this originally. Those conversations can happen side by side. It might help us nuance how we think about the conquest texts in Joshua. At the very least, the conquest texts in Joshua have brought up these nuances for Metropolitan, right? If we add the history of Mother Bethel, right? The Black members, and I think probably at that time it was just licentiates, because white bishops were not ordaining Black clergy at that time. But at St. George, the work that was happening amongst the Black members and Black clergy people or licentiates was building that church, symbolically and literally. And then with the walkout, with the oppression that was happening, that was the tipping point for the walkout. When Mother Bethel was claimed as land, when that was purchased and built to be the first AME church, that's another way to think about. Those folks had already built land. They had produced on land. They had produced a church, not just literally, but balconies and funding campaigns and whatever, but also the spiritual nature of the church, right? Packing the 4:30 a.m. service out, because that's the only service that the white clergy and bishops would give them, right, to lead. They're doing all of that, and come to a place where they're like, no more, this is not going to happen, right? Walk out and then have to figure out where are we going to plant ourselves. So, and even more so, right? The story when the white elders are coming over to Mother Bethel to take it. And they're like, oh no, that's also not going to happen, right? There is the realities of oppression and injustice and systemic oppression have to be part of these conversations. Now, that's not to say that we just go back to the text of Joshua and be like, yeah, just take whatever land you want, right? If something bad happened, then, just go claim it, right? And then throw God's name on it, and then there we go, right?
Well, and that's the difference.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yep, go ahead.
That's the difference, is that we weren't trying to oppress anybody when we purchased land. It was not our intent to go and oppress people or take something that somebody else already had. What we did was a result of that oppression. And the understanding is that you must own some things of yourself.
Right. And whatever is coming as a result of oppression can never be equal to the actions of oppression. It's those are, because that's a lie, right? That's like saying somebody gets abused and they finally fight back, and that's the same thing. It's not, but it happens. All these false equivalencies, again, especially with, certain forms of politics and white evangelicalism, these false equivalencies happen all the time, right? That doesn't also say that Metropolitan couldn't start talking about what it means to honor the original ownership of that land or inhabitation of that land, even though Metropolitan ancestors didn't come in and snatch it from, Native Americans, right? It doesn't exclude that conversation. That could be even a deepening conversation about what it means to be deeply faithful, right? And honorable in the world. It doesn't negate that there can't be an equivalency between the original oppression and the response or resistance to that oppression. Thank you so much for bringing that forward. Sister Marion, please.
Well, I think what Linda says is absolutely right. We purchased it, went through all the correct legal steps, but by doing that, we buy into the system.
Mm-hmm. Say more, please.
Well, then is it that whoever is the last one to own it legally, you just forget about whatever happened before? I don't know. I had never thought about Native Americans owning our land until this discussion. But they were here first. They simply were. So yeah. I don't know. I mean, she's right. We did it the legal way, just as Richard Allen did in Philadelphia, and look what they tried to do to that property.
Mm-hmm.
Hello?
Ooh.
Hello?
Yes.
Thank you. I was just listening to the last two young ladies are speaking, and you yourself. I agree with what you're saying, ma'am. This was a system put upon us as a people. They had laid the foundation of what they've done and taken and stealing the land, and we were slaves. So we come out, whether even to almost to the day, whether it was 10 years when the great Richard Allen did what they did, we were caught up in that. It's not. I personally don't feel that we were abusing the natives, the indigenous people. This is a system that was given to us, and we were just trying to survive. That's how I feel about it. I don't. In the same way, we definitely should honor and give back and help everyone try to get some equity in here. But it wasn't like against or doing what the nationalists did. We didn't have a choice. We just was trying to live too. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Sister Wise Quick, I appreciate that so much. One of the things that you highlighted for us is the zero-sum game, right? If you have some, then I can only have less because there's only this, very small amount of whatever. That they're in the midst of oppression, in the midst of the immediate survival of oppression. And when I say immediate, I don't even mean like always just right in the minute. I mean like, the immediate sense, right? You're coming out of one form of an oppressive system, claiming, land or whatever it happens to be. In the immediacy of that, there are different priorities that are going on, right? That it's more of a zero-sum game because the folks who are holding the system of oppression in place are playing by the zero-sum game. They are creating and protecting a zero-sum game to keep the folks who are the direct targets of that oppression out. By resisting that, so let's say by purchasing the land and building the building of Metropolitan, that's in resistance to that keeping out, right? That is in and of itself, that is a breaking through of that zero-sum game. That doesn't necessarily mean that the breaking open of the zero-sum game doesn't continue beyond the immediacy. It can be a both and, right? So when we talk about like womanist theology, when we talk about theology that centers the experiences of Black women, a lot of that theology is a continuously breaking open of the zero-sum game. Liberation is for everyone. It just plays out different. If someone is in the oppressor group, right, depending on whatever that oppression is, right? So for racism, it's those of us who are white. We are in that oppressor group. For us, our liberation is going to look different than it's going to look for the direct targets of racism, because we're positioned differently within that system, right? That's also a breaking open of the zero-sum game, right? Womanist theology says liberation is for everyone. However, if you're part of the oppression group, your liberation is going to feel horrible.
Yes.
Because we, like for racism, white folks, us, for those of us who are white, it's a whole breaking open of these things that we have felt entitled to and just assume this is the way it is. And we have to let go of that, whether it be voluntarily or because the system of liberation is coming and taking it, right? So if we're talking about, we could do the same thing with the system of ageism, with the system of sexism, and then we've got all the overlapping versions, right? Because it's not like you can just say, like, I'm only, a woman and I don't have a racial identity, right? These conversations can help us dig into that, right? What does it mean for Metropolitan to stand firm in the legacy that Metropolitan represents of Black folks reclaiming in a certain sense, right? Land and a building and space, right? That is theirs, that is y'all's, right? What is claiming that at the very same time and then saying, okay, there's a further history here, even before we got to the place where we were going to purchase this land legally, right? Those things can both happen. And those things those conversations can both happen alongside this Joshua text, right? If we flip back to the Joshua text at this point, then we're looking at, okay, when we say, next week when it goes to the Holy War and the ban, which means slaughter everything, right? When we get to that place, then these same critiques then come there, right? How do we place womanist theology that says liberation for everyone, that we're going to break down this zero-sum game, alongside a biblical text that says, in order to be 100% faithful, you've got to slaughter everything that's not of God, not of you, because you're the ones deciding what is of God, right? We have a whole bunch of like unmuted and hands and all sorts of things going up. So I'd like to start with Sister Marion, Sister Linda, and then if we have time, Sister McKay, Sister Janine.
Well, okay, if we don't acknowledge, if we just buy into this system and say, okay, we'll buy it and we'll forget how those people got it. If we're going to really do right, maybe we need to talk about a whole different system.
Yeah.
Isn't that what we talk about when we talk about God's kingdom? This is like a totally different system, God's kingdom.
Well, I guess. I mean, I haven't heard that, but I would like to hear that.
But like with like Overy Hendricks, Dr. Hendricks?
Make sure that you see the mute.
Well,
flash.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I'm just saying, like,
book. I love the politics of Jesus Christ. Love it.
Love that book too. Sure. And I'm just saying, like, what would happen if we started talking about like when God's kingdom and true shalom for everyone and liberation and the year of Jubilee and all these different things, right? If we started talking about it in tangible ways, and then alongside this, like, what does it mean for Metropolitan to stand fully and claim the faithfulness of what it meant to purchase this land and building, and at the very same time, then reach back and say, what does it mean for us to honor the original inhabitants of this land, right?
Another thing I was just thinking about with this, I took a tour with the DC.
Wait a minute, Sister Janine, we're
sorry.
Sister Marion was still in there and Sister Linda
pardon me.
hasn't jumped in yet. Hold on.
Yeah, I was just saying, whenever I raise like a question of feminism, like why isn't there a woman in the Trinity, the whole bit, the answer I get is, well, you know, that's the way God set it up, or we're talking about an angry God that allows people to be slaughtered, innocents. Well, there's righteous anger and righteous killing.
Sister Aarons, please.
I just think about, especially when we talk about feminist theology, it doesn't necessarily jive with all of my beliefs or my understanding of where I come from as an African-American woman. So, and I think about Native people throughout the world, and those Native people throughout the world, most of them are people that are willing to share and live in community together. And I think that's probably what I'm more interested in, seeing those communities working together with people helping each other. Unfortunately, I live in the United States of America, and that is not the philosophy of the country in which I live. But I think that's what we have to get to if we're ever going to have peace.
Right, and what does it mean to center the theologies of Native American folks if we're having this conversation, this part of the conversation, right? To center the voices and experiences of Black folks as we're talking about Metropolitan, the building and the land. But then when we start to have the other part of the conversation, you know, that might be part of it too. What does it mean to center Native American theologies as we enter into conversation? So thank you. I appreciate that too. Thanks. Sister Janine, I know we're getting ready to scoot out, but
I'll make this quick. I took a tour of Southeast Washington. I'd never been down there. It's east of the park, east of National Park. The whole area is ritzy, really spiffy, you know, artwork, everything. There was maybe one place where there was housing for the elderly. And I'm thinking, and I didn't even know this. I mean, I didn't know about this land. I hadn't been down there. And I was just shocked, absolutely shocked. And of course, it's doing great, wealthy, Genie, Christmas. So that's one thing. The other little thing I wanted to mention is that I think we've got to expand what God is. I mean, have we captured God, you know? And I think that's what white people think. God's on their side. And look at the Asians and the Middle Easterns, all kinds of gods that they worship, you know, and we've got to be aware that we are not the only game in town.
Right. I mean, part of this conversation is how do we understand God and what God is doing in and through us and in the world. Dr. Anne-Marie, I know we're just about to close out, but you're jumping in the chat with some profound wisdom right here. You want to offer a word?
Oh no, I think I've already done that, and I'm not a doctor, but
oh, I'm sorry, my bad.
No, I don't want to steal anyone's thunder who worked that hard. I know y'all folks work hard.
Well, thank you so much for that comment. I thought that Jesus's message, she says, liberation for all, right? I thought that was Jesus's message. So if we're going to start talking about that third move, right? What does that mean for us today? And we start talking about Jesus's message as being liberation for all. We can also look at, like, when he rolled up onto Sadducees and the Pharisees, his engagements with them were totally different than the excluded, right? And his engagements with the disciples were different than those two groups. So he's addressing liberation for all, but he's addressing it contextually, based on like what's at stake for each of those groups, right? Are you excluded or included? Are you excluding people, or are you, right? Are you in the immediacy of resisting a system that's trying to exclude you or harm you? Or are you the group who's trying to be faithful and usually flops all over themselves to do it, right? Jesus is attending to those groups differently. And I think we can think about all these things together and wrestle with it and work it out with fear and trembling, that kind of thing. I think when we're humble about it and we ask the questions, especially amongst lines of difference, right? All sorts of difference, then we're going to get people's perspectives that we might not have individually, but that we can share across those lines of difference and say, if we're going to understand God as a God of all and wanting liberation for all, then what does it mean when we bring these different perspectives and different experiences into play and then talk about what it means to be faithful, rather than just a group that automatically thinks like us and then say, hey, God wants us to slaughter all these other people because they're not us, right? Woo! We did it again. We ran right up into the end. Is there anybody who'd like to pray the end of our time together quickly? Would that be okay? Would somebody pray?
Can I offer just a very short, it's not quite a prayer.
Well, honestly, we just have time to, for somebody to kind of pray us out. I thought, let me ask this. I thought Brother Botts was like moving toward his unmute button. Was that you? Were you doing that? I didn't want to cut you off.
No, I wasn't, but I can.
You were like, Michelle's actually a clergy person because she just voluntold somebody. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
I would be glad to. I'd be
I'm
honored.
sorry, that's my fault. Thank you. I appreciate it. Next time, we'll pick it up next time.
Okay.
Brother Botts.
Let's pray. Spirit of the living God, thank you for falling on us this last hour. Thank you for the wrestling. Thank you for the intelligence, the experiences, just the willingness to struggle with your word. We pray that we take something away from this as we continue to follow into the next book of Joshua. In the meantime, keep us safe, Lord.
Yes.
Protect our families, our communities, protect the church. We love you. We need you. We magnify your holy name. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so
Amen.
much. Thank you, everybody, for your
Amen.
offerings and your participation.
Thank you, Dr. Michelle.
Thank you.
Who's teaching next week? Who's teaching next week? Do we know?
It might be me. I sometimes I don't look until we're, I'm on Sunday or something, but I know I signed up for a bunch of them.
Who's teaching tonight?
Again, like there's a whole list. I'm so sorry. You know what though? I'll do next time. Yeah. Is it
Evan
Reverend
Taylor?
yet? Sister Evan is teaching tonight. You know what I'm going to do in preparation for next time though? When I show up next time, whenever that is, I'm going to have all that information in front of me. So I will, Oh, okay. So Brother Gioni is teaching next week. I will be back sooner or later. Thank you all for having me too. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
This is great.
What is the teacher's name today? What's her
Bye-bye.
name today? The teacher's name today. What's her name?
My name is Michelle
Michelle
Letter.
What?
Michelle.